Hi everyone. Today's topic is collaboration and co-teaching. And in this workshop, we're going to be talking about collaboration not only with your colleagues or your building administrators, but also with families. So throughout the workshop, you will hear a little bit about that also. But today we're just going to focus on the 6 models of co-teaching, and this is based on the work of Dr. Marilyn Friend, who is based in North Carolina. And throughout the country, she is known as the big expert or guru on co-teaching in the country. So I'm going to be using her models to share with you. You should have this PowerPoint presentation within Moodle. Feel free to print it off so you can take notes, or if you would just like to listen, that's absolutely fine also. So let's get started. What is collaboration? And Dr. Friend has a definition that collaboration is a style for direct interaction between at least 2 co-equal parties. I want to stop right there and share with you that in her opinion, co-equal means people who have similar licensures. So we're saying really that a classroom aide or one-on-one aide really should not be put in a position of co-teaching because number one, they certainly haven't had all the background information or courses, or they don't have a licensure like you do as a teacher or as an administrator, and it really isn't fair to put them in that situation. So the point here is that it should be someone of similar licensure. This could be another teacher, obviously. It's typically a general ed intervention specialist. It could be a general ed teacher and an occupational or a speech therapist, language pathologist. It could be an intervention specialist and a related service provider such as an OT or an SLP, speech language pathologist. So that's what we mean by co-equal parties. Now the next word is voluntarily, and I always tell folks when I share information about collaboration and co-teaching that voluntarily doesn't always happen. What typically happens is that your building principal comes to you and says, I need you to co-teach with Mr. or Mrs. So-and-so. I want you in there 1 or 2 periods next year. Make it happen. That's not really voluntary, but I wanted to put that bug in your ear that even though this says it's voluntary, it isn't always. And of course, if that's a situation that you want to put yourself in and you feel that you can be productive and that it will work for the students most importantly, then of course you would want to get involved in that. I also had experiences when I was director of pupil personnel where teachers would come to me and say, we'd really like to work together on this and we'd like your support, and could you send us to a workshop, or could we get some materials, those types of things. That's awesome. So for the most part it isn't voluntary, but it can be. And notice you're engaged in shared, I did say shared decision making, not one person making all the calls, but a shared decision making situation, and you're working towards a common goal. And let's look at the characteristics of collaboration. Look over this screen. I think these are very self-explanatory. I think requiring a mutual goal is absolutely essential, and the goal should be, again, to benefit students. We don't co-teach or collaborate to benefit ourselves or to benefit our administrators. We're doing it because it's best practice for our students. Did you know in federal law, IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which is the federal mandate on special education, that that law requires collaboration. A lot of people don't realize that. For example, general ed teachers now are on most IEP teams. When I was an intervention specialist many years ago, general ed teachers weren't required to attend. And when that was changed in the law, I saw a huge improvement in IEP meetings because general ed teachers can add so much to what's going on in the classroom and how the students are doing for them. So I am so glad that we do have general ed teachers in IEP teams. Increased parent involvement, collaborating again with parents. We have conflict resolution efforts if there is disagreement. There's emphasis on LRE, that's another acronym, least restrictive environment. And we can also have consultative special education services in comparison to direct special ed services. So remember that federal law also requires collaboration. Now, what has happened in the past, and I would say I was part of this teaching back in the 70s and 80s, teachers all kind of did their own thing. They closed the door, they were kind of isolated. Special education teachers, that's what we were called back then, we kind of had some self-contained classrooms when I would say way back in the 70s, and we did not collaborate with others in our building. We all just did our own theory because our own thing, because the theory was, you know, I'm a special ed teacher, I'm the expert in special ed, you're a general ed teacher, you're the expert in general education, which actually caused a big problem because as we wanted to send students out into general ed classrooms, and again, we used to call that mainstreaming, um, teachers who were general ed teachers were like, whoa, I don't know anything about kids with disabilities. I don't know how to teach them. I don't have a degree in special ed. You do. And so it created this whole emphasis that special education was a place. But as you should know by now, I would think special education is not a place, but it's a set of services in the least restrictive environment. Sometimes it is pull out, but we want to start in the general ed classroom if we can. And remember, this is all driven by student needs, not by for our convenience or for the adults. What they want. Again, you have to provide a continuum of services. It can't be all inclusion or all pull-out, all self-contained, all resource room. There should be services provided on the continuum because at any given time a student can move in who needs a specific type of service, and your district has to be ready to provide that service for them. Again, collaboration is a style, there's that word again, that professionals choose to accomplish a goal they share. It's how you work together, not always what you do. Now here's this term, inclusion. And inclusion is really the concept of welcoming students of all backgrounds into your classroom. In this particular workshop, we're focusing more on students with disabilities. You don't always have to have another person in your classroom to call it inclusion. General ed teachers can include students with disabilities and don't even need another adult in there as long as they're following the accommodations and that they feel that they can support that student without another person in the room. So don't get caught up in the idea that we're not doing inclusion in our building because I'm including the students and giving them accommodations. Inclusion is including students. It isn't about how many people as adults are in the classroom. Now, we should have shared problem solving. Co-teaching falls under the umbrella of inclusion, but it doesn't mean the same thing. And of course, we should all be working on teams, and we can have consultation in this model also, where someone can come in and consult with you to help work with students. Now, co-teaching specifically is when two or more teachers, usually it's a general ed teacher and one or more specialists, share the instruction. Now, there's the phrase, share the instruction for a single group of students in a single classroom. Do we give teachers the tools to co-teach, or do we just say, I want you to co-teach this year, and throw them together and see what happens? Okay, the common complaints I hear from general ed teachers, so I take this in the spirit it's given, not trying to hurt anybody's feelings. General ed teachers usually complain to me, hey, Mr. Smith was supposed to be in my classroom, fourth period. He said he had an IEP meeting or he had to write an IEP. He's never showing up fourth period when we're supposed to be co-teaching. Then vice versa, my intervention specialists would complain to me, as soon as I walk into the general ed classroom, Mr. Jones leaves and goes makes phone calls or gets a cup of coffee or gets on the computer and checks his email and leaves the class to me. So when I would hear stories like that, I knew that there really was no co-teaching going on in that classroom. There was no planning. There was no common goal. So keep that in mind, please, as you think about co-teaching. And if you're an administrator taking this workshop, please make sure that you're providing opportunities for your teachers to have the right tools that they'll need to co-teach. Now, here are some things about co-teaching that I think are really cool. Some of the best parts of co-teaching. You can work off each other's strengths. So you have two professionals. They may have two different points of view, but you can have that work together to really benefit the students, because combining their strengths will create options for all students. You may have somebody that's very creative and maybe somebody who takes things very literally, very logically, and they want to do things this way, and having that creative person opens up the door for some of the students that would really benefit from that type of instruction, and vice versa. I do want to caution you again that co-teaching isn't always the answer. You don't always have to have two teachers in that classroom. If the numbers justify it and the needs of the students justify two teachers, then you should try to make that happen. But co-teaching isn't going to solve all your problems if you just throw two people together. And again, remember, I'm going to sound like a broken record, providing the continuum of services, not just inclusion, is what you have to be all about. So let's get into the meat of this and look at the actual 6 models, the 6 ways you can deliver services to students. We're going to go through each one of these. We're going to talk about the pros and the cons. And as we go through, think about which one maybe intrigues you, or you know, what your opinion might be on some of these. I want to caution you also that you shouldn't just pick one style and that's all you do. You need to look at all of these different models, learn about them, and then mix it up. Work with your co-teacher and look at what the actual objective of your lesson plan is, and then say which of these models might work for us. Because too often I would go in to a classroom and what I would see is one teach, one observe, and it was usually the general ed teacher teaching, or one teach, one assist. And I'll show you what those models look like. But I very seldom saw the other co-teaching models. And as we're looking at these, think of the content that could be taught using each of these methods. Think about your subject matter, your grade level, and how these might work for you. I'm going to move this out of our way so we can see this particular slide. Here are the 6 co-teaching approaches. And let's go through each one. The first one teach, one observe. In this model, the first teacher, and it can be either the intervention specialist or the general ed teacher, is the primary teacher and has the primary responsibility for delivering the instruction to the entire group. The second teacher, notice it doesn't say assist, it says observe. In this model, they could be collecting data on a single student or a small group of students. They could be collecting data on specific academic or social behaviors that have been agreed upon ahead of time. Perhaps there's one or two students in the IAT process, the intervention assistance team process, and they need somebody to collect data on their behavior or their academic work. Um, it could be something as simple as, will you keep an eye on Jimmy today during this instructional period? I'm worried he's constantly talking out. Will you check the number of times he calls out an answer during this class period? Or it could be, I'm noticing that Susie is not able to start her work when I give directions. Will you time the amount of time it is for her from when I give the direction until she starts to actually work for me, or whatever it is. Now, there's very little planning involved in this because you could pretty much tell the observer as they came in the room what you wanted them to do. But again, there should be more planning into it rather than that. But that might be a pro for some people. Obviously, if there's another adult in the room, it lowers the student-teacher ratio, except the observer can't really do anything for them because they're just observing. Okay, so this one is one that's not bad to start out with, but you don't want to do it all the time. Don't want to do it all the time. The next is station teaching. Take a look at this one. I'm sure you immediately see the big difference from the first model in that our two teachers have more of a shared responsibility for instruction. In this one, there's a clear division of labor. It actively involves both educators, and students move from station to station according to a predetermined schedule. In the ones I've seen, it's usually 20 minutes, and they have to teach the students to move efficiently and quietly, because that could be a real downside to this model, is that you're wasting instructional time. So you'd have to make sure that you really monitored your students and taught them how to move efficiently from station to station. Now, as you notice, the third station in the middle doesn't seem to have an adult there. It doesn't mean you couldn't use someone like a paraprofessional or a college student who is doing field experience or a well-trained volunteer in your building. They could come in and assist that group in the middle that doesn't have an adult with them. Now, what's also good about this is that it breaks things up for the kids so that there's some movement involved. There could be some issues with pacing from both instructors. So you'd have to make sure that both instructors are done at a close, in a close amount of time to each other. Might have to use a timer, and you have to practice this. This isn't just going to happen overnight. You'd have to do some trial runs. Sometimes the noise could be an issue for the students, and it could be an issue for the adults. You may not be a type of person that really likes to have two people talking at the same time. So you would have to watch the volume of your voice and, again, your pacing. Now, the other thing to remember is that you can't present sequential material in this particular model because it wouldn't work. You would have to make sure that what you're working on flows from table to table. And I want you to think about what kind of a lesson could you cover if you use this model? If it isn't sequential, what could you do? And again, of course, you can play off the strengths of both instructors, because the instructor in the red may want to do more of reviewing concepts. Perhaps the instructor in the blue would like to do a hands-on activity with the students. And then, of course, in the middle, you've got to have an activity that is pretty much independent, because you can't always count on having that third adult in the classroom sometimes. So it might be a computer statement. It could be, excuse me, it could be an independent activity if they're reading or doing an activity that's based on whatever concept you'd have to be working on. Obviously, you're not going to use station teaching to introduce a topic. That's not going to happen. So you'd have to use this in a different manner. Okay, so think about that one. Now the next one is parallel teaching. And in this situation, you're absolutely lowering the teacher-student ratio as you did in the second one. The teachers jointly plan the instruction, but each delivers it to a heterogeneous group of students, usually half the class, kind of splitting up the class and working with them. So not all the kids with disabilities are with the intervention specialists. Everybody is kind of mixed in together. This is good for drill and for practice, test reviews, discussions, projects that need close supervision. Again, you don't want to use this for initial instruction unless you're both feeling qualified to teach that particular concept. And if you are, then that might be a great way to introduce a new topic. Again, the noise and activity level may be an issue. The pacing also has to be coordinated. Now, in this situation, I would also suggest it doesn't always mean you have to be in the same classroom. You could have one group move to another area in the building or another classroom that might be close by. If you're doing something like that, especially if you're going to take a heterogeneous group to a resource room or an intervention specialist might be working, you want to make sure you're telling your parents of your students ahead of time, maybe at open house, or if you have a newsletter that goes out. You want to explain that we're going to have a co-teaching situation this year. Mrs. So-and-so or Mr. So-and-so is going to be coming into my classroom, working with students. Sometimes for space purposes and for noise purposes, they're going to be moving to the special education classroom, so that parents know that ahead of time. I caution you to do that because I did have a very, very well-meaning parent who said to me, you know, I don't have any problem with the co-teaching, but my son came home today and said he was in the special ed classroom, and I just would have liked to have known that ahead of time. Because that scares people. Parents are like, why were they in the special education classroom? What was going on with that? So just keep that in mind, that you make sure that you're informing parents that at times we may move to another classroom, and here's why. It's just a space issue. There's nothing wrong with your child, or we're not giving them additional intervention or anything like that, because that kind of freaks parents out. So that's parallel teaching. Here's alternative teaching. Here is where you select a small number of students to receive instruction that's different from the large group. For example, it could be pre-teaching, reteaching, enrichment, a skills assessment, providing highly intensive instruction within the general ed classroom. Could be for some, maybe some behavioral things, just depends on the kids. Make sure you're not always pulling the same students over into that group, so it doesn't look like the special education group or the gifted group or the troublemakers. You want to mix it up. But for whatever reason that you might need to pull a group of students, this is a nice model that you can use. You could have had some students who were absent and you want to catch them up, or you're doing a review for the test and the teacher in the red is giving a general review, and maybe you have some students who are at risk or kids with disabilities. You can pull them to the side and break it down even more so that they're ready for the test. And also, you don't want to keep them the whole class period pulled. You just want to use that very carefully. So again, the cons could be that you might stigmatize students with disabilities because you're pulling them out all the time, so don't do that. You also just want to switch it up with the instruction. Sometimes the general ed teacher could be the lead teacher, and the general ed teacher could be the one doing the work with the students on the side. And I would also recommend that you keep records of which students are in that small group so you can make sure that you aren't including those same kids the same time all the time. So that's alternative teaching. And again, you're not going to use this when you're introducing perhaps a new concept. You want to use this in the right situation. Teaming. Now, this is not for the faint of heart, and this is the one model that you should not attempt unless you've been co-teaching for a while. I've only seen this successfully happen in one classroom. So that tells you that this takes a long period of time to happen. Doesn't mean it can't, but you really want to be able almost to finish the other person's sentences, that you're that in sync with the other person. And you're going to see an example later in this workshop of some teachers working together, and they're doing a nice job of teaming. Both teachers in this scenario seem to have equal status to the students, so that's very rewarding for the teachers. And again, you can work off each other's strengths, which is very, very helpful. So both teachers are responsible for a lesson. I want to caution you, I haven't mentioned this too much, but in some of the other models, especially the one teach, one observe, and the one teach, one assist, which is coming up, sometimes the special ed teacher is viewed as nothing more than a classroom aide. And you want to avoid that if you're the general ed teacher. You want to make sure that students know that this teacher, you know, is equal to me. In this scenario, it comes across very, very well, and that's why teaming would work well in certain situations. Again, this is where you're both up in front of the classroom or walking around the classroom together. You're both providing direct instruction. So that could work very, very well. And the last model is the one teach, one assist. Take a look at this one. As you can see, this is different from the very first model, which is one teach, one observe, because in this scenario, the teacher who is providing the assistance is moving around the room and can help anybody. It doesn't make any difference. They have a disability, could be a gifted student. You really shouldn't use this every single day. And this is what teachers fall into the trap of doing. Really, this should just be used occasionally because it undermines the credibility of the intervention specialist if they're the one that's always doing the assisting. So again, if you want to use it, at least flip up or flip around who's doing the instruction, who's doing the assisting. Now, this can be distracting to students to have someone walk around the room. Think about that, and I bet you can think of some students who would have some difficulty with that. And the other thing that can happen is that some students who just want attention might become dependent on that person that's providing the assistance. They just crave that attention, but they really know how to do the work. So you can create some dependence that you don't want with that extra person walking around the room. So you have to handle those situations very carefully. Now, for some teachers, they like this because there's very little planning. Very, very little planning. So it would be attractive to people starting out with co-teaching. And I would say that's a plus if you do have limited time to plan. One other plus that I would say is something to consider is that for middle school and high school, when you get into the content area, I've had general ed teachers say to me, I'd prefer to use this model because then Mrs. Smith, who's the intervention specialist, who doesn't have the background perhaps in science or math or history or whatever it is, that they can learn the material with the students and they can see how I present it. And I'd like them to do that for a few months, and then they'll be doing the teaching and I'll be walking around the classroom. And they meant that very, very sincerely. They said, I'm not sure Mrs. Smith is ready to teach this content. And it does put intervention specialists at a disadvantage because everybody expects them to be the jack of all trades and the master of all trades. And they don't know every single content area. So you have to be very careful if you get put in this situation that you may have to learn content if it's middle grades or high school. And so this model may help to get you started. This is pretty self-explanatory. Again, the third bullet point is what I want to emphasize. The best approach depends on the needs, subject, experience, and setting for the students. And it should look a little different every year because it should again be driven by the needs of your students. Now, of course, we know that with collaboration, there's going to be disagreement. You constantly have to encourage people to view the situation from the other person's frame of reference, reevaluate your solutions, watch your attitude, but sometimes disagreements will create better options for students. And you'll see a case study that you'll be doing called The Broken Arm that certainly will show you what can go wrong when you co-teach. Now, if you're a principal out there, here's what you can do to help teachers collaborate and to co-teach. Sometimes you're going to have to be a facilitator if there's a problem, and you have to be willing to step in. And teachers have to be willing to ask for help. If they can't resolve it with their co-teacher first, they have to be brave and ask for help from their administrator, especially if it's hurting the students. I like the third bullet, explicitly making collaboration a standard. I think that is so important. Professional development. And then the first one, of course, making sure your schedules match, trying to give you some planning time so you're not doing it at lunchtime or after school, trying to give you some time to coordinate. If you can have a similar planning time is awesome. All right, that's the end of this presentation. Go ahead and follow the directions for this particular module and you will see the next activities to do. I hope this has been helpful to you and enjoy the rest of the workshop. Thank you.